Hi folks, in this video I want to talk about pump operation. It's very important that a steamer gets enough water. If the steamer doesn't get enough water to fill the boiler, it's not going to heat. So when I get phone calls that explain that the boiler is not heating and there's no pressure on the gauge, that's not necessarily a heating problem. Sometimes it's a water fill problem. And we want to talk about water fill problems because the machines get dirty. So they get dirty from the calcium in the water. They just get dirty from everyday use. So let's talk about what's inside the machine that you actually can't see. You can see the water filter on the outside. That's why we've put the water filter a few years ago on the outside of the machine. So you can look at how the filter is, what kind of debris is in the filter, and know to replace the filter at certain times. So when there's a problem, and again, we instruct you all the time to drain the boiler if you're a heavy user. So we want the boiler drained from the bottom drain plug about once a week when the boiler's cold to make sure that any sediment inside the boiler runs out. That keeps everything as clean as possible. But sediment in your water is going to go through the system and get into your pump before it even goes into the boiler. So most times when pumps go bad, it's because the pump overworks itself. The pump has gotten clogged, there's been restrictions in the pump or the fill tubes. The pump has to work too hard, it gets hot, and then eventually it fails. So if we talk about where the water comes from, here's our pump setup. This is your tube that leads to your water tank. So this is the intake tube that leads into the pump as the pump comes on to request water from your water tank, whether it's a 120, 125, 155, or the 100 machine. You're getting water externally. It's coming through the pump. It's going through this bypass valve, which is separate from the pump. So this bypass valve is a one-way bypass valve, and it sends excess water back to the tank. That's why you have that extra plastic tube going back into your tank. Then we have a fitting that comes outside the bypass valve and eventually goes into your boiler. So this goes like this, and we fill the boiler. So when everything works correctly, when the machine is cold, the pump is going to run for maybe a minute. It's going to pull water out of your refill tank. It's going to fill the boiler as needed. The water sensor is going to pick up on the water level and then stop the pump. Once the pump stops, your green light on the front of the machine goes from solid to blinking green. Blinking green means that it's getting the signal to heat. At that point, it should heat. If the machine does not heat, then we have a heating problem. We don't have a water fill issue. If the green light stays solid green, then we tend to have a water fill problem. Now, if the pump does not run at all, we want to figure out whether it's the pump or the water sensor. So, here's your water sensor, screws into the top of the boiler. We have a blue wire that goes onto the water sensor, leads back to the computer board. As the water begins to fill up inside the boiler, assuming that the pump is running, it's going to hit the bottom. It's going to make contact with the bottom of the water sensor and then stop the pump. That transfers from filling the boiler to heat mode. Now, what we want to find out if we have a water fill problem, if the pump is not running, is it the pump or is it a water sensor? Easy way to figure this out, I'm probably going to ask you to take the lid off the machine to gain access to this water sensor. Simple test is we just disconnect this blue wire from the water sensor. There's no voltage going through here, so you can disconnect the water sensor and leave it off to the side. Plug the machine back in, turn the machine back on. If at that point the pump runs, then we have a bad water sensor because we're bypassing the water sensor and telling the computer to turn the pump on. If the pump does not run with the water sensor disconnected, then most likely we have a bad pump. If we have a bad pump, why do we have a bad pump? These are pretty good pumps, and they just don't tend to go bad on their own. Like I said, most of the time they get clogged with sediment. So we've done this in other maintenance videos. We've showed you this, where this fill tube is actually clogged solid and it can't move any water. So water's never going to get into the boiler at this point. It can't fill the boiler. Then you're going to get your alarm. A lot of people call and say that I have a beeping red light and I have the alarm going off. That's because the pump has run for too long. It has not filled the boiler. The computer has timed out the pump. You're going to get the alarm and the red light to flash. Now, that's a worst case scenario. You could have sediment inside this fitting. We've had sediment that clogs these fittings on either side before it leads into the boiler. We've had sediment inside the bypass valve. In here, there's a little screen that gets clogged. So as the water flows through the water pump and goes through your bypass valve, this bypass valve can get clogged. So we always replace the water pump with the bypass valve. So if the pump fails, we do want to replace the pump, but we also want to make sure as you're replacing the pump that there's no restrictions in the tubing, there's no breaks or cracks or pinholes in the tubing, because then it can't suck correctly. It's like trying to drink your drink with a straw that's broken and you can't suck it. It's just sucking air and not sucking water. So make sure that your water filter, you can blow through it. Make sure the plastic liner on the water filter is not collapsed. Make sure that any of this tubing, blow it with compressed air if you have access to compressed air. I'm going to send you a new pump with the bypass valve. You will have to swap over the fitting at the end of the pump, but then it's important to check your fill tube that goes into the boiler to make sure that there's no restrictions here, and also to take a small screwdriver and poke in there, make sure there's no restrictions there before we replace the water pump, to make sure that when we replace the water pump that we do the job correctly.